When the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M Zero first appeared in the skies over the Pacific, it was more than a plane. It was a ghost that haunted American pilots. Swift, silent, and impossibly agile, it carved through Allied aircraft like a scalpel through silk. Pilots whispered about it in mess halls and briefing tents, calling it invincible, calling it untouchable. The Zero wasn't just an airplane. It was a statement that Japan ruled the skies of the Pacific. Early in the war, U.S. Navy pilots flying outdated Wildcats stood little chance. Dogfights were short and merciless. The Zero could climb faster, turn tighter, and strike before its prey even knew it was there. Every engagement seemed to tell the same story. American planes fell in flames while the sleek Silver Zero danced away, untouched. The Navy desperately needed a weapon that could turn the tide. But to defeat an enemy like that, they had to first understand it, down to the last bolt and wire. That opportunity came one clear morning in June 1942, when American patrol spotted something unusual near the Aleutian Islands. A Japanese Zero, far from home, appeared in the sky, but something was wrong. The pilot was flying low, erratic, his engine coughing. Anti-aircraft fire hit him, and the plane went down hard on a lonely island called Akutan. The pilot was killed instantly, but the aircraft, miraculously, was almost completely intact. The Akutan Zero, as it came to be known, became the most valuable wreck in the Pacific War. When U.S. forces recovered it, engineers couldn't believe their luck. It was like finding a living blueprint of Japan's deadliest weapon. They crated the plane up and shipped it to San Diego, where a small team of engineers and test pilots began the most secret project in naval aviation, learning every secret the Zero had. But one man in particular would unlock the mystery, a test pilot named Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders. Calm under pressure, sharp-eyed, and fearless in the cockpit, Sanders had flown everything the Navy had in its arsenal, yet even he understood the stakes. The Zero had humiliated Allied forces for months. Now, he was about to fly the very aircraft that had caused that devastation. Every switch, every sound, every vibration mattered. This was no ordinary test flight. It was a duel between pilot and machine, one that could decide the fate of the Pacific Air War. When Sanders first sat inside the Zero, he noticed how different it was from anything American engineers had built. The cockpit was small, cramped, but perfectly optimized. The controls were light, almost too light, and the plane felt alive, twitching under the slightest touch. The Japanese had stripped away every ounce of unnecessary weight to make it the ultimate dogfighter. No armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks. Every ounce saved was an ounce gained in agility. It was designed for offense, not survival. During the first flight tests, Sanders realized just how nimble the Zero was. It could outturn anything in the U.S. inventory. The controls stayed responsive even at low speeds, allowing it to loop and roll effortlessly. But he also found its Achilles heel, something the Japanese pilots didn't want anyone to know. The Zero's control surfaces stiffened badly at high speeds. The very lightness that gave it agility became its curse when pushed to the limit. At over 300 miles per hour, the controls froze up, making sharp turns or dives nearly impossible. Sanders also found that the engine cut out during fast dives because of fuel starvation. Suddenly, the invincible Zero didn't look so untouchable after all. Those test flights became the foundation for everything that followed. Every note Sanders took was studied by engineers at Grumman, the company tasked with building the Navy's next-generation fighter. They listened carefully to his reports, and one idea guided their design: build a plane that can fight a Zero on its own terms and win. The result would be the F6F Hellcat, a brute of a fighter, bigger, tougher, and faster than anything Japan could field. But before it could take its place in history, the engineers needed more than just blueprints. They needed to understand how the Zero thought. What did it do when cornered? How did it evade? What was its rhythm in the sky? That's where Sanders' work became priceless. He didn't just fly the Zero. He studied it like a living creature. He found how it turned best at specific speeds, how it lost control in steep dives, and how its light frame could be shattered by heavy caliber rounds. Every secret he uncovered was fed straight into the Hellcat's design. When Sanders pushed the Zero into a high-speed dive, the stick locked up. He could barely move it. "There it is," he said calmly over the radio. "This is where we beat it." In that moment, America had cracked the code. For the first time, the U.S. Navy had an edge, not just in machinery, but in knowledge. They knew how the enemy flew, how the enemy thought, and soon they'd have a weapon designed to exploit every weakness the Zero had. But no one, not even Sanders, could have predicted what would come next. The F6F Hellcat wouldn't just challenge the Zero. It would utterly dominate it, racking up one of the most lopsided kill ratios in aviation history. And it all began with that one wrecked fighter on a remote Alaskan island, and a test pilot brave enough to fly it. The story of how the Hellcat became the undisputed king of the Pacific skies is one of engineering brilliance, pilot courage, and sheer determination. Because in war, knowledge is as deadly as firepower, and this knowledge turned the tide of the entire air war in the Pacific. The sky was about to change forever. When Grumman's engineers received Eddie Sanders' detailed flight reports, they didn't see just numbers or notes. They saw opportunity. The Akutan Zero had given them a rare glimpse into the enemy's soul, and they intended to use every ounce of that knowledge. Leroy Grumman, the head of Grumman Aircraft Engineering, was a practical man. He believed in building planes that pilots could trust, machines that could take damage, keep flying, and bring their men home. The Zero had taught him that the Japanese valued agility over protection, but Grumman wanted both strength and speed. He told his engineers, "The Navy doesn't need another racehorse. It needs a tiger that can take a punch." The Hellcat was born from that philosophy. Engineers widened its wingspan, strengthened its fuselage, and gave it armor plating the Zero could never dream of. They added self-sealing fuel tanks, so the aircraft wouldn't turn into a flying torch when hit. Under the cowling, they packed a powerful Pratt & Whitney R 2800 double Wasp engine, a 2,000 horsepower beast that gave the Hellcat brutal speed and climb. In the skies, this new fighter was a monster. It could dive faster than the Zero, roll out of danger, and absorb hits that would have shredded the Japanese plane. But what truly made it deadly wasn't its engine or guns. It was how American pilots used the lessons from Sanders' test flights. They learned never to engage the Zero in a slow, turning fight. Instead, they attacked from above with energy and altitude, diving at high speed, firing in short bursts, and climbing back to safety before the Zero could respond. They called it the boom and zoom tactic, and it turned every engagement into a control hunt. By the time the Hellcat entered combat in 1943, the tables had turned. The once feared Zero was now facing a new predator, one that had studied it, dissected it, and evolved beyond it. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in 1944, the results were staggering. American Hellcats tore through the Japanese air armada, destroying more than 300 planes in a single day. Pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. For every Hellcat loss, 19 Japanese aircraft went down, a 19-to-1 kill ratio, unheard of in aviation history. It was more than a victory. It was domination. The Hellcat had transformed the Pacific skies from a place of terror into a domain of American air superiority. But behind those statistics were stories. Incredible, human stories of courage, skill, and split-second survival, like the pilot David McCampbell, the Navy's top ace, who flew his Hellcat Mincy III. In one single mission over the Philippines, McCampbell shot down 9 enemy aircraft in less than 2 hours. He would end the war with 34 aerial victories, most of them in a Hellcat. And then there was Alexander Vrashew, another Hellcat ace, who once downed 6 Zeros in 8 minutes during the same campaign. These weren't just lucky pilots. They were men flying machines that had been built from knowledge wrung out of the enemy's own creation. Every rivet, every curve of the Hellcat's wing was influenced by Sanders' test flights in that captured Zero. Engineers even matched its handling characteristics in low-speed combat to ensure American pilots could predict and counter every maneuver the Japanese might use. What's fascinating is that the Hellcat wasn't a flashy aircraft. It didn't have the elegant lines of the Mustang or the exotic appeal of the Corsair. It was rugged, boxy, and built like a hammer, exactly what Grumman intended. It didn't need to look graceful. It needed to win. Pilots often said, if you're in a Hellcat, you've already won half the fight. Its wide undercarriage made carrier landings safer, its cockpit visibility was superb, and its firepower, .50 caliber Browning machine guns, could shred a Zero in seconds. But here's something few people realize. The Hellcat's development from prototype to combat-ready fighter took less than 2 years, a record-breaking pace, even during wartime. The urgency of war and the knowledge gained from the captured Zero pushed engineers to their limits. Every single test flight, every blueprint modification, carried the weight of men's lives. In the early combat trials, U.S. pilots couldn't believe what they were flying. After months of struggling against the Zero, they suddenly had a fighter that could dive faster, climb higher, and survive head-on attacks. The psychological shift was enormous. Morale skyrocketed. Pilots who once dreaded facing the enemy now went looking for them. Eddie Sanders himself, watching from the test airfields in California, knew exactly what he was witnessing. The Hellcat wasn't just a new plane. It was an embodiment of lessons written in sweat, fear, and the wreckage of war. The captured Zero had done its part. Now, it was time for its American counterpart to settle the score. But the irony ran deep. The same aircraft that had once symbolized Japan's dominance had unknowingly helped design the weapon that would destroy its own legacy. It was almost poetic, the student defeating the master using the master's own teachings. Even Japanese pilots began to notice. They described the Hellcat as unstoppable. Many reported that no matter how hard they turned, the American plane always seemed to be above them, waiting to strike. The tactics Sanders' testing had revealed were now being used with devastating precision. And beyond the battles, the Hellcat became more than a weapon. It was a symbol of industrial might and resilience. Built in massive numbers, over 12,000 rolled off assembly lines in just 2 years. It wasn't the prettiest plane, but it was the right plane at the right time. The war in the Pacific was changing fast. Japan's early advantage in air power was crumbling, and the Hellcat was at the center of that transformation. Wherever American carriers went, the deep, rumbling sound of the Hellcat's engines followed, a promise that the skies would soon belong to them. But while the Hellcat's triumphs were mounting, few people knew just how close the story came to never happening at all. Because if that one Zero hadn't crashed on Akutan Island, if Eddie Sanders hadn't dared to test it to its limits, the outcome of countless air battles might have been very different. The legend of the Hellcat was built on risk, and that risk was about to reach its most dramatic moment, because one final test flight would push the limits of both man and machine, and reveal just how much the U.S. Navy had learned from its deadliest enemy. In the quiet morning air over Naval Air Station San Diego, the captured Zero shimmered in the sunlight. Its pale gray skin, scarred and patched, still carried the soul of the enemy. Eddie Sanders climbed into the cockpit one last time, strapping himself in, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The engineers gathered below knew this would be the final series of test flights, the ones that would define every lesson learned from this mysterious machine. Sanders had already unlocked most of the Zero's secrets. Its agility, its turning ability, its weaknesses at high speeds. But there was one more question to answer. How far could it be pushed before it broke? The Navy needed to know the Zero's limits, not just to beat it, but to predict its every move in combat. As he took off, the Zero's engine roared to life with that familiar, almost delicate hum. Sanders eased it skyward, feeling the lightness of its frame, the razor-sharp responsiveness of its controls. Then at altitude, he pushed it hard, diving faster, rolling sharper, forcing the airframe to its edge. The plane bucked and trembled as he dove at full throttle. The controls began to lock up. The stick refused to move. The engine sputtered. It was a moment he had been searching for, the breaking point. Sanders kept his hand steady and his mind calm, recording every second. Then, at just the right moment, he pulled the Zero out of the dive. The wings groaned, the bolts screamed, but the aircraft held together. He leveled out, breathing hard. He had just defined the edge of the Zero's world. Back on the ground, his data became the final piece of the puzzle. Engineers and tacticians studied his notes for hours, building training manuals that spread across every Navy carrier in the Pacific. Never dogfight a Zero, they warned. Dive, shoot, climb, and hit them where they can't follow. The Hellcat squadrons absorbed those lessons like gospel. And soon, the skies began to fill with blue-painted fighters, roaring off carrier decks toward islands whose names will be written in blood and history: Tarawa, Truk, Saipan, Iwo Jima. When the Hellcats met the Zeros in those skies, the results were brutal and decisive. The Japanese pilots still fought with courage and skill, but their machines, once the terror of the Pacific, were outmatched in every way. American pilots now understood their enemies so completely that dogfights often lasted mere seconds. Dive, fire, climb, the Zero would stall, spin, or burst into flame before it could react. In one after-action report, a Hellcat pilot wrote, "We owe a debt to that test pilot who flew the captured Zero. He taught us how to live." The numbers tell their own story. By the end of the war, the Hellcat had destroyed more than 5,000 enemy aircraft, nearly 3/4 of all aerial victories by the U.S. Navy, and it did it with a kill ratio that seemed almost impossible. 19 victories for every one loss. The Hellcat didn't just beat the Zero. It erased its legend. But Eddie Sanders never saw himself as a hero. In interviews after the war, he downplayed his role. "I just flew the airplane," he'd say quietly. Yet everyone in the aviation community knew that his courage, climbing into an enemy machine alone, with no guarantee it would even hold together, had changed the course of the Pacific War. There's a quiet kind of heroism in stories like this, the kind that doesn't make headlines but changes history. Sanders' flights didn't happen in a dogfight over the ocean, but on empty runways and quiet test ranges. Yet every time a Hellcat pilot climbed into his cockpit, every time another squadron returned from combat alive, the echoes of those test flights could be felt. The captured Zero itself would never fly again after testing ended. It was studied, dismantled, and eventually lost to time, destroyed in a training accident years later. But its legacy lived on, not as a symbol of Japanese power, but as the spark that ignited American victory. The story feels almost poetic. One aircraft, designed to dominate, ends up teaching its enemy how to defeat it. A single wreck on a frozen island reshapes the balance of power in a global war. And one test pilot's courage transforms a nation's fear into confidence, turning the tide of history. When the war finally ended in 1945, and Hellcats returned to their carriers for the last time, their fuselages were scarred and burned but victorious. Pilots climbed down from their cockpits, knowing they had flown a machine that embodied the lessons of pain, loss, and hard-won knowledge. The Hellcat's roar faded from the skies, replaced by jets in the dawn of a new age. But its legacy remained, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, understanding your enemy can become your greatest weapon. Looking back, the story of the captured Zero isn't just about metal and machinery. It's about curiosity, about the bravery to ask, what makes the enemy strong? And the genius to turn that answer into victory. It's a story of innovation born from desperation, and of one man who risked everything to understand what others feared. The F6F Hellcat became the Navy's greatest fighter, not because it was perfect, but because it was built on lessons earned in fire. And the Akutan Zero, that lonely ghost of the Pacific, became its unwilling teacher. In the end, every Hellcat that soared into battle carried a piece of that captured plane within it, and the spirit of the test pilot who dared to face the unknown. From a frozen tundra of Alaska to the blazing skies over the Pacific, the journey of that one aircraft changed the destiny of nations. And that's how one test pilot's captured Zero turned America's F6F Hellcat into a 19-to-1 killing machine, the ultimate predator of the Pacific skies.